1978 saw real hopes of a breakthrough in the Middle East as US President Carter brought together Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin for peace talks at Camp David. It was the year of 3 popes, as the death of Paul VI was followed within weeks by that of John Paul I. His successor, the Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, took the same name, becoming John Paul II. Also in Italy, crowds demonstrated against the Red Brigade terrorists as former Prime Minister Aldo Moro was kidnapped and then murdered. And horror came to Jonestown, Guyana, as some 913 members of an American religious cult committed mass suicide. On the evening of Monday, the 16th of January, a car drew up at the Blenheim Arms Hotel in North Berwick, a small town near Edinburgh. 2 men booked in for the night. Something about them made the hotel owner uneasy, so he mentioned their arrival to the local police in case they might be con men or thieves casing the hotel. The police became very interested when they found that the men's car registration number was false, and 2 constables were sent to bring them in. The men were having dinner when the policemen arrived. They were allowed to finish, and then they and their car were taken to the police station. There they explained that they were on a touring holiday before emigrating to Australia, and gave their names as John Blackman and Roy Fontaine Hall. Hall asked to go to the lavatory and disappeared into the night through a window. He was soon recaptured in a taxi at a police roadblock and got back to the police station to be confronted with more serious news. At about 10 the previous evening, the boot of the car had been opened and a body found in it. Hall was searched, and some tablets, which he claimed were tranquilizers, were taken from him. But he then asked for a glass of water and managed to swallow something from a packet which he had produced from somewhere on his body. Immediately he collapsed unconscious and was rushed to Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, where his stomach was pumped. While Hall was in hospital, his companion, confronted with the body, had begun to talk, admitting that his real name was Michael Kitto, a small-time crook from London. So that by the time Hall returned, the police were ready to detain him. At first, only on a holding charge relating to some silver Tudor coins and other apparently stolen objects which had been found.
Following the discovery in North Berwick on 16th January 1978 of a motor car containing a deceased body, a person named Archibald Thomson Hall, 53 years of age, of no fixed abode, appeared before Sheriff Kenneth Middleton in the Sheriff Court, Herington, on a petition containing a charge of theft of property in England. He is in custody and will appear again in a week's time.
Kitto knew Archibald Hall as Roy Fontaine, and it was under this name that the police discovered that he had a long string of convictions, none of them, as yet, for murder. Kitto identified the body as that of Fontaine's brother, Donald Hall. He then shocked his interviewers by going on to say that he wanted to confess to being involved in the killing of 3 other people. His story began a few months earlier in a seedy area around London's King's Cross station. A friend named Mary Coggle, who operated as a prostitute, introduced him to a man who had an interesting proposition. The man was Roy Fontaine, a conman and thief, and in a pub near Harrods he explained to Kitto how he specialized in becoming butler to elderly and wealthy couples before robbing them. His current employers were a wealthy 82-year-old businessman, Walter Scott Elliot, and Dorothy, his wife. They lived in a luxury flat on London's exclusive Sloane Street. Fontaine had worked for them for several weeks, having given false references. The Scott Elliots, like many others before them, had been taken in by his suave and plausible manner. Walter Scott Elliot was an old Etonian and a former captain in the Coldstream Guards. He had made a fortune in India before returning to Britain in the late 30s. In 1938, he had married Baroness Alice von Grölle, who worked at the German embassy in London, despite the personal objections of the ambassador, Joachim von Ribbentrop. After the war, Scott Elliot had become a Labour MP and served as private secretary to the Secretary of State for War from 1946 to 47. Divorced in 1948, he married Dorothy Nunn, daughter of a rich Calcutta merchant who was 22 years younger than him. The couple had houses in France and Italy, substantial investments, and a superb collection of antiques. Fontaine had decided that he needed an accomplice to help empty the Scott Elliots' bank accounts before stealing their treasures. Fontaine assured Kitto that Mrs. Scott Elliot was away at a clinic and that he had left her husband safely drugged asleep. So they left the pub and went to look at their target. On arrival, they were shocked to discover that Mrs. Scott Elliot was at home in bed. As Fontaine later claimed in a tape-recorded confession, he overreacted.
It was a thing that should never have happened.
As Mrs. Scott Elliot appeared suddenly out of the bedroom and asked what he was doing at that hour with a strange man, he knocked her to the ground and smothered her with a pillow. Mr. Scott Elliot stirred, but was reassured that his wife had only had a nightmare. Determined to keep the old man alive so as to get his signature and loot his investments, Fontaine and Kitto now contacted Mary Coggle and persuaded her to impersonate Mrs. Scott Elliot. The next day, with Mrs. Scott Elliott's body in the boot of their car and Mr. Scott Elliot heavily drugged beside a black-wigged Mary Coggle, they set off driving north. From London, they drove to Carlisle on the Scottish border, and then to Newton Arlosh, where Fontaine had rented a cottage. After spending the night there, they drove into Scotland, stopping for lunch at the village of Crieff, near Perth. Then in the wild Highland country west of Crieff, about 15 miles beyond the village of Comrie, Dorothy Scott Elliott's body was buried. The four then drove back to Newton Arlosh. Over the next 2 days, they decided that Mr. Scott Elliot, although so heavily drugged he did not know what was going on, was too much of a liability and must be killed. He was driven back into Scotland on the 13th of December, with Coggle still persuading him that she was his wife. After spending a night without incident at an hotel near Inverness, they reached lonely Glenafrique. Here, Fontaine tried to strangle Walter Scott Elliot, but his victim fought back fiercely and had to be battered to death with a spade. His body was left under heather and leaves beside a small burn. Fontaine seemed to have no regrets, only surprise at the old man's strength.
I was amazed at the strength that was within him. I was sure it was as if he was draining all the strength from all the Scotch ancestors of his that had gone before. And I walked up, back into the car, and Mary asked me, was it over? And I said to her, yes.
The trio then headed south to Edinburgh, where they got rid of some stolen antiques they had brought with them. Mary Coggle was becoming particularly excited by Mrs. Scott Elliott's jewellery and fur coat, and was desperate to return to London to show them off to her friends. Fontaine warned her that she would arouse suspicion, but she would not listen. When he tried to burn the coat, she refused to part with it. Finally, he struck her with a poker and then suffocated her. On the 18th of December, Fontaine and Kitto headed back into Scotland with Mary Coggle's body in the boot. Near the village of Middleby, they dumped it in a stream called Backburn. This time they were so eager to get rid of the body that they made no effort to conceal it. For the next month, the two men stayed in the cottage at Newton Arlosh, making several trips back to London to empty the Scott Elliots' flat and dispose of the antiques. They told the caretaker that the couple had gone abroad unexpectedly for Christmas. Kitto's confession had solved one mystery for the police, for Mary Coggle's body had been discovered by a shepherd on Christmas Eve, but they had been unable to identify her. Having accounted for 3 deaths, Kitto now went on to explain how yet another body had been discovered in the boot of Fontaine's car. Fontaine's true name was Archibald Hall, and he had a brother, 17 years younger, named Donald, who had also taken to crime. Donald had been released from prison on the 13th of January 1978, having served a 3-year sentence for housebreaking. For some reason, Fontaine allowed Donald to come to the cottage at Newton Arlosh. He had never liked his younger brother, whom their adopted sister described as a snivelling little small-time crook, and he soon regretted his family loyalty. For Donald quickly began showing an unhealthy interest in what his elder brother had been up to, and was heard boasting in the local pub about the jobs they were going to do together. He seemed unable to keep his mouth shut, and Fontaine soon saw him as another liability who would bring the law down on them. Within a few days, Donald, while rashly showing his deadly elder brother how easy it was to secure someone by tying up their thumbs, was chloroformed and then drowned. The next day, with yet another body concealed in the boot of their car, Kitto and Fontaine set off into Scotland again. Fatefully, they decided to spend the night at North Berwick before heading into the Highlands to dispose of the body. Following Kitto's confession, a police team headed for the cottage at Newton Arlosh. There they found plenty of evidence to back up his extraordinary story of multiple murders and bodies being driven over the border and deep into Scotland. The cottage contained bloodstains and fingerprints which matched the woman found at Backburn. There was also linen with the crest of the Scott Elliots. Another team went north to Glen Affric. The next day they found the skull of Walter Scott Elliot. However, Kitto could not be so precise about the exact location of Mrs. Scott Elliott's body, and this remained unfound, despite a lengthy search. By the time Fontaine was brought back from hospital and charged, police had also found out a great deal about the man who was obviously the ringleader in this series of gruesome crimes. Archibald Hall had been born on the 17th of July, 1924, in Glasgow. His family was poor, but seemed at first to be close-knit and happy. However, by the time he was 13, Hall was well known as a minor thief. In 1941, 17-year-old Hall, or Fontaine as he was starting to call himself, was sent to prison for the first time for theft and forgery. From then on, his working life was to be devoted to crime. As a child, Fontaine had been obsessed with dressing up and jewelry. As an adult, he became determined to find ways of enjoying the finer things in life. He used his first days in prison to cultivate a new accent and to learn as much as he could about jewelry and all sorts of antiques. In the intervals between sentences, he trained as a valet and butler, and used these accomplishments to become a professional con man and thief. A skilled actor, he would get a post as butler, sometimes arranging for his prospective employer to phone him at a call box to get a glowing reference. On one occasion, he borrowed an invitation to his employer and impersonated him at a royal garden party at Holyrood House in Edinburgh. His suave manner and cultivated bearing gained him entry to many wealthy households, most of which would soon be considerably poorer, as he either robbed them himself or arranged for accomplices to come in. Unfortunately, Fontaine's skill in fooling his victims was not matched by an ability to avoid arrest, and he spent about 3/4 of his adult life in prison. He consoled himself while inside with homosexual affairs. Outside, he got married and had a number of girlfriends. Despite his failure to stay out of prison, Fontaine seems to have regarded himself for many years as a master jewel thief, a bit of a gentleman like the legendary Raffles. Psychologists had diagnosed him as a classic psychopath, totally self-centered and ruthless in obtaining his own wishes. Yet until 1977, Fontaine had never used violence in any of his crimes. But by the time he killed Mrs. Scott Elliot, Fontaine's self-belief was collapsing, and he was ready to use ruthless methods to avoid capture. Once arrested and faced with the evidence of his crimes, he did not attempt to defend himself, but made a confession which backed up that of Kitto in every respect. He then made another attempt to kill himself. While in hospital for the second time, he announced that he might as well confess to a 5th murder. At the end of May the previous year, he had applied for and got the job of butler to Lady Peggy Hudson, the widow of a former Conservative minister. She lived at Kirtleton Hall, just over the Scottish border in Dumfriesshire. Lady Hudson was much impressed by her new butler, whom she knew as Roy Hall, but surprised that such an experienced man would take a job in such a remote place. Fontaine explained that he liked the country life, but failed to mention that he also liked Lady Hudson's excellent collection of antiques. When he suggested a friend of his as gardener, Lady Hudson was happy to agree. David Wright was a handsome 30-year-old who knew a great deal about shooting, fishing, and estate management. He had also been Fontaine's lover in prison, and was eager to get on with robbing his new employer. Fontaine was also ready to do so, but wanted time to prepare a perfect alibi. Tensions increased rapidly at Kirtleton Hall, as Wright began threatening to tell Lady Hudson about Fontaine's past if they did not carry out the robbery soon. While Lady Hudson was away, Fontaine discovered that Wright had already stolen some of her jewelry. He seems to have decided that his friend had become too much of a liability. The next morning, he suggested that they should go rabbit shooting. Wright went ahead, and after he had blasted off both barrels of his shotgun and had not reloaded, Fontaine had him at his mercy.
I picked up my gun and I turned it, and instead of aiming for the rabbit, I swung it round and I shot him through the head. I walked over to him and he was muttering. I shot him again, and then again, and then once more.
Fontaine buried Wright's body on the estate and told Lady Hudson that his friend had left suddenly after receiving another job offer. Lady Hudson was surprised by this, and even more so when she received an anonymous telephone call warning her to be careful if she had anyone called Roy Hall working for her. Checks were made, Hall's past as Roy Fontaine uncovered, and he was dismissed with 1 month's salary. Liking the area, he took the cottage at Newton Arlush and set about finding another post. Towards the end of October, he saw the Scott Elliott's advertisement. Once again, his excellent references got him the post. Fontaine now seemed eager to help the police locate both the body of David Wright and that of Dorothy Scott Elliott. But the weather did not help. While the searches continued, reporters were concerned to find out whether the bizarre case which had already yielded so many bodies might get even wider.
Well, we are concerned mainly with 5 bodies in this area, 3 of which we know about, and we are still looking for the other 2. But the inquiries are quite extensive, as you realize. It covers the area from the Metropolitan Police northwards throughout the country to Inverness.
But despite the atrocious weather conditions which were then affecting Scotland, the police were eventually able to track down the missing bodies. This enabled them to bring charges on the murders which had been carried out in Scotland, those of Walter Scott Elliott and David Wright. The other 3 murders, of Dorothy Scott Elliott, Mary Cogle and Donald Hall, had taken place in England, and although charges were brought at the same time, Fontaine and Kitto would be tried later under English law, despite the fact that the bodies had been left in Scotland. The first set of trials began on Tuesday, the 2nd of May, 1978, in Edinburgh Crown Court. Lord Wiley presided and heard Michael Kitto admit to being an accessory in the case of Walter Scott Elliott. Fontaine pleaded guilty to both murders. The prosecution was able to produce evidence that although a psychopath and totally without remorse, he was legally sane and fit to enter such a plea. Kitto's defense counsel tried to depict his client as a helpless victim, completely under Fontaine's domination. Lord Wiley sentenced both men to life imprisonment, setting a minimum sentence of 15 years for Fontaine. 6 months later, on Wednesday, the 1st of November, 1978, Fontaine and Kitto were brought to London's Old Bailey to be tried for the other killings before the Recorder of London, James Miskin QC. He heard Fontaine plead guilty to the murders of Mary Cogle and his brother, Donald Hall. But Fontaine claimed that the death of Dorothy Scott Elliott had been manslaughter, as did Kitto, who entered the same plea on Donald Hall. He did, however, plead guilty to the murder of Mary Cogle. After 3 hours, Mr. Recorder Miskin accepted that Kitto had been heavily influenced by Fontaine, but gave him a sentence of a minimum of 15 years in prison. He then sent Fontaine to prison with the recommendation that he should never be released. Fontaine campaigned strenuously to be sent back to a prison in Scotland, but was continually refused. More than 15 years later, he was still in prison. He seems likely to stay there for the rest of his life, paying for the sudden, brutal outburst of murder which he carried out after a life devoted to less serious crime.